Part six of Fort King. Well, if you survive this long through all six parts of the William King video, then give yourself a diploma or certificate of completion. If you've survived this far, Fort King, what can I say? It's probably the most interesting fort and most connected to Florida history that we have. And the final part is after the Army leaves. What happens to it? As most forts in Florida, when they're abandoned, they even burn down, rot away. A lot of times the settlers just cannibalize the timbers for their own houses, and it's gone soon after. Not so much with Fort King. And let me advance this. Okay. Not so much with Fort King. And this is an image by James Gray, made off the image of John T. Sprague of Fort King. You have the walls, you have the blacksmith shop on the left-hand side, and just really good picture. So this man, Judge Isaac Bronson, he was a judge in Florida, federal judge or circuit judge. His house is in Palatka, and you can visit that today. It's run by the Putnam County Historical Society, uh, right near the river. And next door is the Putnam County Historical Society Museum, and is in the surviving officers' quarters of the old Fort Shannon in Palatka. Now, in front of this house, the judge is still there. He's just buried in the ground in the grassy park in front of the house. Judge Isaac Bronson to Commissioner of General Land Office, Thomas Blake. This is October 14th, 1844. The Fort King was abandoned about a year and a half before this. So Marion County is formed, and it's needing a new courthouse. Marion County was created during the last legislative session, and Judge Bronson is required to hold a court. There's no building to do that in Marion County except at Fort King. There's one building there that would fill the purpose of the courthouse at the fort, and General Worth is in favor of turning it over to the U.S. Marshal for that purpose. The government will have no objection to the land. It was reserved for a military reservation, and they'll see if it was surveyed and ask the marshal to take possession of the building and keep out intruders, keep out squatters, make sure the land doesn't inadvertently go up for sale, as part of the Armed Occupation Act or whatever happened. So on October 23rd, 1844, there's actually a small detachment at Fort King of a subaltern that's like a lieutenant, sergeant, and 5 privates. So basically caretakers of Fort King, 7 Army soldiers. They don't need all the buildings at Fort King, so Judge Bronson asks that Fort King be used as a courthouse, take the main barracks building with the cupola on top, the center building right there. The land commissioner Blake to Judge Bronson on same day, October 23rd, 1844, requests that Fort King be occupied as courthouse and not be put up for sale. The judge is asking for a plat of survey of precise location of the buildings. There was a permit filed under the Armed Occupation Act of adjacent land, but it was invalidated, so it was not honored. So when the government abandons a fort, it's supposed to go to the Treasury Department, and it goes up for auction after that. And so Secretary of War to Commissioner Blake of the Land Office per Judge Bronson's request. The Secretary of War is instructed that the Army Quartermaster see about releasing the buildings for use as Marion County Court. So Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hunt, who is the quartermaster in Florida, to Lieutenant Jordan, I guess who's the subaltern, who was the caretaker, Hunt asks that the buildings at Fort King be turned over to the U.S. Marshal, John Beard, and that he signs for him. And if they have to be used again for military purpose, they'll return them in the same shape that they are turned over. So, if the Army needs them back, give them back the same shape that you received them. November 24th, 1844, John T. Sprague. In Florida, he's Colonel Worth's adjutant and aide, married Colonel Worth's daughter. He's the one who did this drawing. 2, Lieutenant Colonel Hunt, General Worth is pleased to release all the buildings at Fort King, except building number 2 and 3 to the U.S. Marshal Beard to be used as a court. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hunt to General Jessup. General Jessup is Quartermaster General, who, of course, was here at Fort King and in Florida commanded the troops during the war. The buildings at Fort King are mostly dilapidated and unfit for occupation. So they're kind of crumbling. Lieutenant John King at Fort King, I guess that's who the subaltern is, to General Jessup. He says that the U.S. Marshal Beard did not sign the receipt for turning over the buildings to verify the condition they were in. They'll be turned over unconditionally. So even though the marshal wasn't there to sign for them, they're being turned over anyway. So a year later, and this is February 9th, 1845, General Worth to General Jessup, Army Quartermaster. Worth recommends the abandonment of the military reservation and the buildings be reserved as public court. The buildings are in bad shape and crumbling in ruinous condition and rapid decay. Once turned over to the land office, they'll be put up for auction. So what it is that they tried building chimneys at one point, but the limestone in the area is really not, it doesn't hold together real well and crumbles. And so and the bugs are getting, I guess, into the lumber. So it's rotting away quickly. February 24th, 1845, General Jessup, Quartermaster to Thomas Blake, Commissioner General Land Office. Fort King is no longer needed for any military purpose and can be abandoned. February 9th, 1846, the Secretary of War to the Secretary of Treasury. Fort King is no longer needed for military purposes and can be turned over to the Department of Treasury for disposition of public lands. In August 12th, 1846, so this is almost 2 years after an initial request from Judge Bronson to use as a courthouse, Sheriff House, who's the first sheriff of Marion County, to the Secretary of War, the last commander of the post, sold the public buildings. Some were retained as a courthouse. 2 buildings were taken possession by a Major William Russell, a collector of customs of the Indian River, who has enclosed all the buildings in a fence and put up a sign to keep out. He asked, what should the sheriff do? So that's interesting. And Major William Russell put up a sign saying that all squatters need to vacate, even if they have gardens and improvements. He just kind of moved in and took over some of the buildings of Fort King. Also August 1846, Mr. John G. Reardon to James Shield, Land Office in Washington, D.C. William Russell, a Deputy Inspector of Customs on the Indian River, has posted notice at one of the buildings at Fort King that he has authority to take possession of the place and no one else is allowed. Mr. Russell has taken possession of the building and fenced in 15 acres, which include improvements made by 2 other people worth $500 to $600, which in today's dollars, $20,000 to $25,000 today. And there's a flyer, Mr. Russell, saying whoever is occupying that section needs to leave. This is all pretty strange because Mr. Russell is Deputy Customs Inspector of the Indian River settlement, which is down at St. Lucie Inlet. What's he doing in Ocala, Marion County, is what I want to know. The Indian River settlement is in fact burned by the Seminole and Miccosukee warriors 3 years later in July 1849. And at that time, Mr. Russell will be shot in the arm and his family will flee to New Smyrna. So kind of interesting that destruction of the Indian River settlement by the Miccosukes in 1849 was what helped touch off the Panic of 1849. And I'm kind of thinking that they had an axe to grind against Mr. Russell and the sutler that they killed in the incident there on the Indian River. Okay, 6 months later, January 16th, 1847, David Levy Yulee writes to the Secretary of War on the status of the military reservation relinquished. Now, remember, at this point, Florida is now a state. February 1st, 1847, Secretary of War to General Land Office forwarding a request of David Yulee, a copy of the letter relinquishing the military reservation. And the following letter, dated February 9th, 1845, a letter in General Worth's handwriting to relinquish the military reservation and request that the buildings set aside for federal court and other buildings be put up for public auction. So that's kind of the last we hear of the fort at this point. It serves as Marion County Courthouse, except it's abandoned not long after they're already building a new courthouse in Ocala, and that will be completed and occupied by 1850. And when we had our Seminole War convocation in Bushnell a couple weeks ago, one of the things said was in 1890s, there was actually two buildings that still remained of Fort King that the people were occupying or using. There's a blockhouse and another building from Fort King, but no word on what condition or what shape, if it even had a roof at that point, or what they were using for. So apparently some of the remains of Fort King remained up into the 1890s. Well, 75 years later, when Dade Battlefield was created as a public park in 1922, 1921, it was reserved as a park, and the land was finally obtained in 1922. And there is a push at the same time to preserve Fort King as a park. But there was a problem at that point. There's a letter dated May 13th, 1924, from Mr. Robert Anderson in Ocala to Senator Duncan Fletcher. Senator Fletcher is the longest serving senator that Florida ever had. He served for 36 years. And Mr. Anderson in Ocala is looking to compile a brief history of the history of Fort King and looking for any information on it. A note afterwards, the letter said that the troops were withdrawn on March 25th, 1843. The post was relinquished on February 9th, 1846. On September 8th, 1842, the Adjutant General requested that a military reservation of 4 square miles be reserved, but apparently this was never done. May 15th, 1924, Senator Duncan Fletcher to Army Adjutant General Robert Davis requests that any information on Fort King be sent to Mr. Robert Anderson in Ocala, any charts, drawings, or anything. Apparently, they didn't have many records to send to him. That existed May 21st, 1924. Secretary of War to Secretary of Interior, asking that he transmits any records they have. June 12th, 1924, Secretary of Interior to Attorney Mr. Anderson in Ocala. In 1842, the Adjutant General recommended that land be set aside for a military reservation, but it appears that was never declared and filed with the land office. No records are in the land office. No plans or drawing of the forts are in file. If it wasn't for John T. Sprague making this drawing here, we wouldn't have anything, much of a description on Fort King. So in March 1st, 1927, so just almost 100 years ago, 97 years ago, Secretary of Interior to Congressman R.A. Green, Senator Fletcher, I think, has died at this point. He died, I think, in the previous year. The plat survey shows that an area of 40 acres was set aside for Fort King. It was supposed to be declared a military reservation, but apparently that was never done. And the military just took possession of the land and erected buildings. They didn't know that it was, they do know that the area was used as military purposes because troops were withdrawn in May 25, 1843. Well, of course it was used for military purposes because we have the post returns covered from 1827 to 1843. The last commanding officer apparently sold some of the buildings to private individuals. In 1846, the Secretary of War directed that the Secretary of Treasury dispose of the buildings, but there's no record that was ever done. The land of the former military reservation is now privately owned, and it is not possible to set aside as a national monument. So Dr. Joe Knish disputes that statement, saying that they could have done that. But the Daughters of the American Revolution has land, and they could relinquish it and set that aside for a monument. And what they're talking about is the Daughters of the American Revolution have this monument here on the former cemetery of Fort King. And I don't know when that was established. There's some pictures in the Florida Memory. Monuments like this were kind of common around the 1930s. There's some pictures on Florida Memory of it. And it's interesting, it doesn't cover that large a plot of land. So, it's not enough land to make a national monument. But it's kind of interesting that when Dade Battlefield was made a park, that there is a push at the same time to make Fort King a park as well. Okay. Oh, I guess Congressman Fletcher or Senator Fletcher's still alive. I was mistaken there because February 20th, 1933, Secretary of Interior writes to Senator Fletcher, said the land was supposed to be set aside as a military reservation, but apparently a military reservation was never declared. And it says that the last commanding officer at Fort King sold some of the buildings to private individuals, and the buildings were not disposed of in 1846. But there is no evidence that they were ever disposed of by the Department of Treasury either. So it's a bit murky on the ownership of the land, apparently. October 10th, 1938. So, 86 years ago, says in 1842, it was requested that 4 miles square of land be set aside for military purposes, but it never was. And that's kind of the end of the microfilm roll that I got from Frank Laumer's collection. Apparently the land was never settled at that point, and houses were built around it until about year 2000. The land went up for sale by the McCoy family, or I'm sorry, the McCall family. Dr. McCall, a physician in there, and who had owned the land for several decades. But the cemetery you can still see on side of Fort King. And it's my contention, there's about 70 people that are originally buried there. And I don't know if they all were sent to Fort King, because you read the orders of the burials that are supposed to be taken. Fort King would include soldiers who were killed in combat and officers, and not everyone fits that description who was buried here in the cemetery. There's a historical marker. Originally, it was on Fort King Street. Here's a picture of it a few years ago, which made it kind of dangerous. There's no place to park. Uh, like most historical markers, they're put in kind of hazardous places that you have to risk your life to see, and there's no pull off. Finally, when they built the park, they moved it to kind of the front entrance of the park. And after years, the county and city did a joint agreement to acquire it. It was declared a national landmark, and they started rebuilding the fort. I think this is around 2017, maybe. And as soon as that was done, they started holding reenactments, which they've held for about the past 5 years, which is pretty cool. And here's the park that you can visit today. Notice that it's missing one thing, and that's the center building with the cupola. That was the courthouse. So it's a work in progress. It's not finished yet. And I would really love to see that completed one of these days. If I ever live to see it, I don't know. Well, the blacksmith shop was recently recreated here, right near the original site of the blacksmith shop. So that's a cool addition. And here's once again, the original sketch of Fort King. And also, about 1962, or maybe it was 1960, maybe it was Hurricane Donna blew over an oak tree and exposed a wine bottle collection. And and so anyway, there's an archaeology dig going on right now, an archaeology school, Gulf Archaeology Research Institute. And I'll put the link in the description below that you can actually join on the digs for these. They're going on this summer at Fort King. I think they go on till October, which is pretty cool. So if you want to be part of the archaeology work, uh, as even if you can't handle a shovel, you can still help curate some of the artifacts. And so that is the end of the Fort King series. Make yourself a completion certificate, because if you survived all of that, that's about 3 hours video, I imagine. And congratulations. Now we'll move on to something else.